Good afternoon. This is Professor Arnold, and today I'm going to discuss how to determine a five-number summary and how to construct a box plot using the five-number summary. So let's begin. We will do that by an example. The test scores for a certain class were 8, 27, 45. You know what? I want you to write these down. So write down 8, 27, 45, 48, 50, 52, 55, 58, 57, and 98. Now these are already in ascending order. So if you were doing this by hand, you would have to either put it in ascending order or in descending order, because the five-number summary consists of the lowest, the first quartile, the median or the second quartile, the third quartile, and the maximum. So right away you already know two values. You know 8 is the minimum and 98 is the maximum. I'm telling you this because we're going to use a calculator, and you need to have some checks and balances when we do that. So the question would be stated similar to the following. First question would say find the five-number summary, find the lower and upper fences. I will explain what those are. Determine the outliers of the data. Again, I will explain. And finally, to draw a box plot of the data. So we're going to use a calculator. So let's begin. Let's look at how we find number A. Solution to number A. We're going to use a TI 83 or 84 calculator, and we'll put that into our calculator, the data. Let me get my calculator. So I have my calculator now, and those numbers that I asked you to write down, remember the 8 all the way up to 98. So you'll put those into the calculator, and the way you do that is you press Start, Edit, and then you'll see some columns, and they're all numbered L1, L2, L3. You want to use L1. You don't have to, but for the purposes of this presentation, we will use L1. So we go and we put those numbers in there, and then now we're ready to do the five-number summary. So I'll give you 10 seconds to put those numbers in there. Remember, I asked you to write them down. So again, you say Start, Edit, L1, and the numbers you're going to put in there. Okay, once we get the numbers in there, to obtain a five-number summary, you come back to the calculator and you say Start. This time you wouldn't hit Edit, but you'd hit Calc, C-A-L-C, and then you'll tell it that the data is in L1. So you hit L1, and then you'll see things like the mean and standard deviation, the sum of the numbers, things like that. On other occasions, you're going to need those numbers, but for right now, we need numbers that are further down. So scroll down on the calculator. I'm doing the same thing. I hit here, and I scroll down. Okay, and Start, Calc, one variable, and then I scroll down, and I'll see min x, right? You'll see Q1 equals to 45, Q2 or median equals to 51, and Q3 equal to 58, and the max x equals to 98. Now, like I said, you have to be careful and make sure that the numbers are okay, they match with what you put in. And one good check is whether you have the minimum and the maximum correct. On. The next thing is we are going to calculate the lower and upper fence. Well, let's define them first. The lower fence is Q1 minus 1.5 times the IQR. The IQR is the interquartile range. So the interquartile range is the difference between Q3 and Q1. So we calculated Q3 before, it was 58, and Q1 was 45. So we can plug those in, and you'll get Q1 is 45 minus 1.5 times 58 minus 45. See how that is? And the rest is just arithmetic, and we'll get 25.5. So now let's go to the upper fence. The upper fence, on the other hand, is 1.5 times the IQR further up or further to the right. So we add that, which is 1.5 times IQR, which is 19.5, and the Q3 was 58, hence we get 77.5. So we have two numbers here. I want you to take note of them. One is the lower fence, LF you can call it, is 25.5, and the upper fence, UF, is 77.5. So you wrote those down because we're going to use them in the next step. So remember, you have to answer the questions that they ask you. So they ask us for the lower fence and the upper fence, so we give that as our answer. Let's go on to the next step, and that is the outliers of the data. So what are outliers? Outliers are points in the data set that are outside of the lower and upper fences. So you see I form an interval from 25.5 to 77.5. Those are the two numbers I asked you to write down. So the 25.5 is the lower fence and 77.5 is the upper fence. So anything outside of these bounds would be considered outliers. So by inspection, just looking at the data and comparing it to the lower fence and the upper fence, we see that 8 is smaller than 25.5, and we also see that 98 is bigger than 77.5. So lucky for us, we do have outliers. Not only do we have outliers, we have something called a low outlier. A low outlier is one that is less than the lower fence, and that is 8. And a high outlier is one that is greater than the upper fence, and in this case it's 98. So there we have the answer to that part C of our question, and now we're ready to do part. So we're going to do part D manually, which is to draw a box plot of the data. So we know the data goes from 8 to 98. So a good scale would be from, say, 0 to 100. That way we can see everything that the graph has. So I'm going to draw an axis, horizontal axis. Now you can also draw a vertical axis. It doesn't have to be horizontal. I am doing it horizontal because we're going to do this on the calculator also, and the calculator does do horizontal. But if you were doing multiple box plots for comparison, it would look better if you used vertical. So like I said, we're going to use horizontal, and we're going to put in our little scale here. We're going to put in a tick marks, and then my scale goes from 0, 10, 20 all the way up to 100. The data will fit in here very nicely. So what's the first thing? We need to draw the vertical lines where the mean, the median, the Q1 and the Q3 are. So those first three lines there, you see I have those lines there, those will be the vertical hash marks, and then we draw horizontal lines to make a box around it, hence the word box plot. Now a box plot is also called a box and whiskers diagram. The whiskers are lines that go from the quartiles, so from Q1 or from Q3 to the last point that is within the data set before the outliers. In other words, all the points that lie in the data set within the fences would be covered by the two whiskers. So I'm going to put those in. See, one would go, I'm going to put the numbers above so we can put some perspective on this. So you see the 8 is the minimum, the 27 is the last point within the limits, the lower bound and the upper bound, and the 77 is likewise, that's the last point going to the right that is within the data set that is within the lower and upper bounds. 98 is not within the bounds, so for that reason he is out, so he's an outlier. And the way we indicate outliers is by stars. So you put in a star here at the 8, and then you put one in here at the 98 to indicate that we have outliers. Again, 8 is a low outlier, 98 is a high outlier. Now, we also put a little line next to each of the last points within the bounds. So you should have one at 27. See, I have it in there already. And then I'll put one where the 77 is. There we go. It's in there. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is our box plot. Now I'm going to show you another way to do this, which is not the manual way, which is to use the TI-83 or the TI-84 calculator. You can do both to compare them. Sometimes you have an assignment to do it manually. You can do it manually, then you do it on the calculator, compare, make sure you have the same thing. If you don't, then you need to answer a few questions. Why don't you have the same results? Okay, so to start off, to do it on the calculator, we have several steps. The first step is to press second y equals. So let me tell you where those are on the calculator. The second key is in the second row on your calculator. It's the first key on the second row of your calculator. Y equal is the first key on the top row of the calculator. So we hit that. I'm going to do it also so we can talk the same language. Have to turn it on. Okay, so I'm in there. And the next step is to turn on plot 1. So you see there's a set of plots there. You want to select plot 1. And when you hit enter, it turns the graph on. So you hit enter and it's on. It toggles. If you hit it again, it will be off. So now you arrow over with the right arrow, and you will see there are, on the second line, you see there are 6 plots. So you arrow over until you get the plot that you are interested in. So there are 2 box plots. There's one with some dots at the beginning of it and at the end of it. And the other one is just a straight line going to a little bar. So what is the difference? And which one do we want? The 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth graph is a box plot, but that is a simple box plot. And that in that one, the whisker goes from the quartiles to the maximum. And for the third quartile, it goes, for the first quartile, it goes to the minimum. So I'll say that again. The one line on the left goes to the minimum, and one line on the right goes from Q3 to the maximum. That's a simple box plot. The most sophisticated box plot is the one that we are doing, and so we're going to use the fourth graph. So we're going to hit that. Hit it, and then that means we have selected that box plot. And then the next step is to tell it where the data is. So below it, you will see it says, probably the calculator already says L1. If your data is on L1, then that's fine. If not, you'll have to tell it where it is. So if that it was L2 sitting there and your data is in L1, you make it L1. So now, how do you make it L1? To make it L1, you use second 1. So second 1 is L1, second 2 is L2, and so on. Okay, the other thing is the frequency. So it wants to know, even though you have the data in L1, is it just one column, or do you have another column that tells me what the frequencies are? And the answer in this particular case is it's a 1. So how we put a 1 in there? You say alpha 1. So you see that for 1 it's alpha 1, but for L1 it's second 1. So for us, we're going to use alpha 1 because we're going to set the frequency to 1. That's the 5th step. And then now we're ready to graph. So you say press the graph key. When you hit the graph key, up, I got it the first time. So sometimes you wouldn't get it necessarily. Most of the time it means that the window is bad. So you go back and set the window. So you see the X values that we used were from 0 to 100 on the graph before. Well, you would do something similar on your calculator. You set the window from minimum 0 for X, maximum 100. You don't want to use the max and minimum that is on the data, because then you wouldn't see the little edges. You wouldn't know where it starts, because it's going to start way up in the corner, the vertical line to the left. So you want to give it a little bit of padding. So I would start at 0 rather than at 8. Okay, so that brings us to the end of this presentation, and I will see you again in another presentation. If this was a little fast, don't worry. Play it again, stop it at the points where you have to go to the calculator, and try it again. Have a nice day.